So, good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. I appreciate the fact that you're here today. It means a lot to me, and because your time is precious. So, thank you for being here. Today is a special day. I have a very unique individual in the studio today. His name is Obed Silva. He has an amazing story to tell, and I'm going to turn it over to him immediately. Obed, first of all, I want to welcome you to
Thank
the
you.
Hamilton Review.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
It's absolutely my pleasure to have you and to meet you. So, Obed, you've written a book, and I'm about ready to look at that book and read it. But you have a very interesting story to tell, and about your life and what you're doing today. By the way, friends, he is a associate professor at East LA College. He is in the English department. He has an emphasis in medieval studies, which goes from 500 AD to about 1400 AD. We're going to talk about that, but I'm curious to know what got you into that world.
Sure.
But before we do, I'd like you just, first of all, welcome, and I'd like you just to kind of share with everyone a little bit about your background, where you're from, what were the major things that happened in your life that brought you to where you're at today.
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Mexico. I was born in Chihuahua, Mexico. And at 1 year old, my mom brought me over here. She was escaping the wrath of my father.
Okay.
He was an abusive husband and alcoholic and drug addict. And so we came to this country in 1980.
Okay.
And we arrived in a city called Westminster in Orange County.
Sure, absolutely.
And we lived there for a few years, spent a lot of my childhood there. And one of my mother's first job was picking strawberry, celery, tomatoes, which was the first job of many of my family members in the city of Irvine.
Sure.
Where all of those industrial buildings are now.
Yeah.
Those corporate buildings. All that used to be nothing but fields.
Amazing.
So my family, that was their first job, my mother's first job. And gradually she improved on herself, taking night classes after work, learning English at a school in Fountain Valley, where she would ride her Schwinn bicycle, which was her first mode of transportation when she was here. Later, when she learned a little bit of English, she was able to greet people. So her second job was a gas station attendant in the city of Santa Ana.
Santa Ana.
And so she would ride her bicycle in the wee hours of the morning from Westminster all the way to Santa Ana. So my mother has always been a very hardworking individual, very determined, disciplined, and voracious reader, which is a very important part of my story.
Sure.
And so that was my upbringing for the most part. My mother was a single mother here in the United States. She had the support of my uncles, who would later come to the United States to live with her. And
that was where it began. Did you have contact with your father? Was there, from time to time, would you go back to Mexico and visit him down there, or how did that go?
I would. And my father initially came following my mother, looking for her. And for some time, he did live with us. But again, the abuse continued. And eventually my mother said, I just can't do this. So he eventually got the point and returned to Mexico. And my mother divorced him when I was 5 years old.
I see.
And after that, I would visit my father in the summers. So my mother would take me to Mexico because we have other family there, aunts, uncles, from my mother's side. But during those visits, I would get to see my father. And to me, my father was my father, was a loving, doting father, just like any good father would be. But of course, the other side of that was that he continued to be an alcoholic and abuse drugs and things of that nature.
And you saw that as a young kid?
Not as a young kid. I would come to see that later. And that's a big part of my book, The Death of My Father, the Pope.
Yeah.
That's what it addresses more than anything, our tumultuous relationship.
Yeah.
But as a child, as a youth, I would say I had a great relationship with my father.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I think that fathers are complicated, aren't they? And
Extremely.
we all have fathers. I had a father who was very loving to me, but he wasn't without his scars. I mean, he came from a different background too, and he had some very very real things that were there in his life that manifested from time to time. Not drug abuse, not alcoholism, but other issues came out. So we all come from these families, which I've you know what, Obed, I have to say. I am a pediatrician. I see families all day long.
Mhm.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure there are too many families that don't have issues. Everyone's family seems to have something, but this affected you.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, distance, genetics. You're a doctor, uh, but my book, what it tries to do, it tries to come to a conclusion as to whether a son can be much like his father, even though there's grand distance between them.
Yes.
Because I'm very much like my father. I too am an alcoholic. I too have had issues with drugs. I've never laid a hand on a woman the way my father would beat my mother and later his other wife. But nonetheless, these issues just kept you know bearing fruit in my life.
Yeah.
They never went away. And as I got older, because my mother was always working. When I came into my teens, when I would come home, there would be no one home.
Yeah.
And, I was a latchkey child from, maybe third grade all the way until like high school.
Did you have siblings?
I did not have siblings until I was 15.
Okay.
So for a long time, it was just me.
Yeah.
It was my father, my mother, and myself and my uncles.
Okay.
But as it is the case with many young people, especially young boys, when there's no one at home and you come home, uh, you look for refuge in other places.
Yeah.
And that refuge I found in the streets with my friends, because a lot of my friends lived the same experience. The father wasn't in the household.
Yeah.
They would come home, the mother was working, so there'd be nobody home. Maybe a grandma, a grandpa, an aunt, or an uncle, but it's not the same as coming
No.
home to a parent.
You're right.
And so that's where later my gang involvement would come into play. Finding refuge in the streets and involving myself with groups of young boys that were already engaging in gang activity.
Yeah. So this began when you were 10, 11, 12. When did that whole gang, I mean, obviously you lived in areas where you were aware of gangs.
Sure. Yeah. Well, one of my biggest role models was a cousin of mine who is now deceased. He died of an fentanyl overdose about 3 years ago.
Oh boy!
Right after the 4th of July, and he was my role model. He was like a brother to me. He was a cousin, but I saw him as my brother. And he was gang involved early on. He lived in the city of Santana, on a street called Highland, which was the name of the gang as well. And that street, I remember when I was a child, I used to go there, and there was always talk about a murder that happened the night before. I experienced shootings, and he went to the California Youth Authority when he was, I believe, 14 for the first time for conspiracy to commit murder. And so I didn't get to see him after that for many years, but nonetheless, the seed had been planted in me that I wanted to be like him.
Sure.
And even though he was gone, I was able to see him and the other boys that in my neighborhood, in the city where I was growing up, were living a similar lifestyle. And so I gravitated to that. And I started to gravitate to that maybe like around age 12 or 13.
Okay.
But, I started admiring that lifestyle even younger than that because I had seen it from an early age.
So what is it that, because this is a theme with a lot of kids who in these, what did you admire about that? Was it just their courage or their bravado or just the way they live their life? I mean, what were the things that particularly caused you to look at that and say, I want that for me too?
Yeah, from what you just mentioned, all of the above. I would check all of the
Yeah.
above, and if it was a survey or an exam. In the same manner that we glorify soldiers
Yeah.
and we admire soldiers when they come back from war,
Yep.
it's a similar type of attention that if you're a child growing up in these neighborhoods, that child applies to these gang members because you do admire their bravado, their courage, their camaraderie, their fearlessness, their
Yeah.
fierceness, their willingness to put themselves in danger. And, you hear the people in the community, in the neighborhood speak of them individually by their names, and you're eavesdropping as a child, and you can't comprehend the complexity of the lifestyle. But there are certain things that a child can catch on to
Yeah.
and become attracted to. Just as when a child goes to see a war movie and they see these soldiers, and the next thing they want to do is go to the toy store and buy a bag of toy soldiers and
Yep.
mimic that
The behavior.
experience.
Yeah. No. So this was something that you were pretty much surrounded by as a kid. You came home, you were alone, probably were lonely. You had friends out there. Did you guys I'm sure you were playing sports as well, playing basketball and doing that kind of thing. It wasn't all gang activities. I'm sure you had other things too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, kick the can, hide and go seek, all those street games that children used to play back in the 80s and 90s before technology took over our brains.
Yeah.
All of that came into play. There was a innocence there. And even the early days of being involved in gang activity, there's an innocence there too, but it eventually, of course, it becomes lost.
Yeah. When you start getting into, I'm sure when you get into drugs, now the violence is something that scares me. When I hear about gang violence, I think this is ruthless. This is really in your face kind of stuff. And how did that affect you when you were a young kid?
Yeah, well, I didn't get myself involved in gangs first. My first initiation was with tagging crews, because I'm an artist and I've always wanted to be an artist, even as a child. My father was an artist, but his talent became bastardized because he preferred to drink and do drugs than pursue an artistic career. But when I was a child, I used to ask my mom to place me in art classes or art school. But her answer to that was always, I can't afford it. It's too expensive. And I would later ask her, well, how about some art materials, paint, brushes, markers, whatever? And that too was too expensive. So in the early 90s, graffiti and graffiti crews were big. So that's was my first involvement in and I want to say gang culture, because the tagging led to that eventually.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, stealing spray cans wasn't expensive. And the canvas, I didn't have to purchase one. The walls were already there. So I got involved in that maybe at the late age 12 and then 13. And at 13 is the first time I ever went to juvenile hall.
Okay.
And
was that for tagging?
No, it was for an incident that occurred on school campus when I was in 8th grade.
Okay.
And what I considered a prank, the school did not. I initially I in the restroom, I placed a young man against the wall, and I searched them because the bathroom was full of graffiti.
Yeah.
And so I went into like this hall monitor persona or police officer persona and accused him of having done it. And he hadn't done it. I was just being a bully, and I wanted to instill fear in him. And I took out his wallet and I searched it. All he had was his ID card.
Yeah.
And he was afraid, and I could see it. And in a morbid way, it brought joy to me.
Oh.
Because
you can make a person afraid. That I could actually instill that fear.
Exactly. Something I'm not proud of today.
Yeah.
So I went to class. He went to class, and the next day I was called into the office, and I was suspended for 2-3 days, something like that. But while while on suspension, the police came to my house and arrested me. And I was charged with attempted robbery and assault and battery.
Well,
I didn't even know what that meant, assault and battery. I thought
yeah.
well, the images I conjured up in my mind was assault shaker and a battery. I was 13 years old. I was a kid.
Yeah.
Attempted robbery, I kind of, okay, that made a little more sense.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, that was my first experience in juvenile hall, and that experience is what changed everything for me. I remember the first night, I was on the second floor of this particular unit, and next to me, I could hear screaming all night and crying. And it's a small cell, probably the size of this carpet here. And all the other boys in the other cells are screaming the entire night, cursing at this other person in this cell next to me, telling them to shut up,
Yeah.
amongst other curse words.
Yeah.
And the next morning when we were let out, the doors open and I come out, and the person that comes out from the cell next to mine is a little boy, probably about 7 years old. And his eyes are red and puffy, and his cheeks from crying all night. And his clothes are just like 5-10 times his size. His pant legs are cuffed up, probably about 4 inches and rolled over probably about 5 times. This is a little boy. They didn't have clothes for him. And that shocked me.
Yeah.
And all of these other boys wanted to tear him apart because he wouldn't let them sleep all night. So that was like the first shocking image of being in juvenile hall. And the other thing that was impactful for me on that first experience there in juvenile hall was that the boys that had the most respect and were the most feared were the ones that were gang members. They were gang involved. And so when I saw that, I knew what I had to do when I left that institution. And that was join one of the neighborhood gangs in the city.
Were they soliciting you before? Did they ever say to you, hey, Obed, we want you, come on, why aren't you part of us? Had that invitation been made?
They exactly right. That invitation had been extended to me, not by one gang, but by numerous gangs within the city. Because that's what gangs do. They recruit just like the Marines recruit, just like the military recruits.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I enjoyed graffiti. I enjoyed the thrill and the rush and excitement of going onto a freeway and running across the lanes and graffitiing the dividers and the walls and things of that nature.
How did you feel later on after you saw your graffiti when you're driving down the street? You kind of go, hey, dude, I did that. Did you feel a sense of pride?
I sure did. I dwelled on it. It was exciting to see my name, my graffiti name up there, to see it on an overpass or a billboard even. It's recognition, young people want to be recognized. Yeah. And they'll do what it takes to achieve that goal. And for us with graffiti, we achieved that goal within our own community of graffiti writers. It's a way of marketing, promotion, just like Pepsi will put up a billboard or any type of company.
So people would know your tag. They would go, oh, Obed did that.
Sure. Or by my moniker.
Yeah. Did your mother know that you were doing this?
She did once I began to get arrested for it. Yeah.
I guess she had no choice.
She had no choice.
She had no choice. So, okay, we're gonna listen. I'm fascinated by this conversation. I'm gonna take a 1 minute break here, and we're gonna come right back. And so, friends, you're listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. We're speaking today with Obed Silva. He is a professor at East LA College, and we're gonna be right back.
The Hamilton Review podcast is brought to you by Hamilton Babies, 9 kid-friendly products designed for the little loves in your life. Find them at hamiltonbabies.com or amazon.com. Also consider Dr. Hamilton's recently published book, 7 Secrets of the Newborn, available at Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore, and amazon.com.
Okay, friends, welcome back to the Hamilton Review. We're continuing our conversation today with Professor Obed Silva. And Dr. Silva, our Obed. Let's try that again.
Professor.
You're
I'm not
professor.
that-
Professor. You're not, okay. Third time, Michael. Third time. Okay, friends, welcome back to the Hamilton Review. We're continuing our conversation today with Obed Silva, a professor at East LA College. So, Obed, take it away. You got the microphone again. Continue your conversation, your story, which is fascinating.
Yes. So after leaving juvenile hall, that first time, uh, I joined a gang now.
Yeah.
So I left the tagging behind and became gang involved. And of course that came with just a multitude of just problems, from drug use to violence,
Yeah.
violence with guns, violence with knives, violence with just our fists. But violence was always there. Alongside with
And that violence was against other gangs, I
other
presume.
gangs,
Yeah.
correct. And with that also came other criminal activity like robberies, whether it be stealing cars, stealing from businesses, stealing from residencies, and my life just spiraled out of control after that. So much so that I would be because when you're released from juvenile hall, you're not just freely released. You're placed under probation,
Sure.
where you're constantly watched.
Yeah.
And anything can cause a violation, from curfew, not being home at 10, or not going to school, or just committing another crime and being caught for it. So it became a revolving door.
And you were 13 at this age? Or
13,
13.
leading into 14, 15, 16 years
Okay.
old. And, when I started high school, my first high school, I was kicked out within 2 weeks for fighting.
Okay.
And then I went to another high school and the same thing occurred. I was kicked out again for fighting in the class. Sent me to a continuation school, same thing happened. It was like clockwork, like you knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And again, I was kicked out for fighting. And I've never had a great relationship with school ever since maybe even in my elementary years.
Yeah.
And a lot of that stemmed from, being a English learner. English is my second language. Not having a parent at home to help me with my homework.
Yep.
And my teachers, when I would come to class without the homework, they would penalize me. Say, not really looking into the reasons why I hadn't done my homework.
Sure.
So that instilled me a hate for school. I didn't like school. So when I reached the 9th grade and I started being kicked out, to me, I saw it like a good achievement. That meant that I didn't have to go back to school. And so eventually in the 9th grade, I just never went back. I dropped out completely. But what eventually ended up happening when I turned 16, I was arrested for the last time as a juvenile and sentenced for the last time as a juvenile. And that was for grand theft auto, for stealing cars. And they gave me 9 months in juvenile hall. And I was serving the 9 months.
Was that the longest period you had
Yes,
ever
sir.
been in? Okay.
Yes, sir. And I was 16 when I entered to serve that sentence. And two good things happened while I was in juvenile hall at this time. The first thing is that I got my GED. And the second thing is that I read my first 3 books ever for the first time while I was there. And so I was at camp in Los Pinos, which is in Lake Elsinore off Ortega Highway. It's closed now. They closed it down now. But while I was there, I was involved in 3 fights. And at the third fight, before the third fight, they sentenced me to 30 days in solitary confinement.
Wow.
And what that entailed was being brought back down to juvenile hall in Orange County in the city of Orange. And to serve those 30 days in a cell, again, about the size of this carpet here, or this rug rather. And you're in the cell for 23 hours a day and you're only let out for 1. And I don't think they're allowed to do that no more. I think under the Obama administration, that was banned. And rightfully so, because it's very detrimental for children. Because I believe I was a child still.
Sure. Yeah.
So for 23 hours, you're in the cell. And on Sunday, on the first Sunday of me serving that time, my mother came to visit me. My mother never missed a Sunday. And if it was every day, she would not miss any of those days. So she comes on a Sunday, and we're in the visiting room, and the visiting room is just a bunch of white, like, plastic tables that, whenever you attend a birthday party or something, and plastic white chairs on each side, and there's columns of them. And on one side are all the boys, and on the other side are all the mothers. And I say mothers because it was rare when you would see a father. And not to say that the fathers didn't want to come, but I would assume that perhaps they had work or something kept them from being there. And maybe, some were absent in the family altogether. And on this particular day, my mother's sitting across from me, and she tells me, "Son, I brought you something." And I got excited. I said, "What'd you bring me, Mom?" She said, "I brought you a book." And I said, "A book?" And then I said, "Like a lowrider magazine?" Because every month she would bring me the new issue of Lowrider, but I was surprised because she had just brought me the most recent one only a couple weeks before. And she goes, "No, I brought you a book." And then again, I was in thought, and I said, "Did you bring me an Archie's comic book?" Because that was the other thing that she would bring me. She said, "No, I brought you a real book." And I was kind of disappointed. I thought my mom knew me better, and she did know me better. Now I realize.
Yeah.
And she said, "No, I brought you a real book." And she saw how I was not very receptive to it. And a tear started to well up in her eyes. And one actually came down her cheek. And I reached out to her, and I placed my hand on top of hers. And I said, "Mom, I'll read it." And once I said that, her entire countenance changed. Her frown turned into a smile, and she wiped that tear away. And she said, "You promise?" And I said, "I promise, Mom." And that was it. I went back to my cell. They took me back to my cell. The door closed. A few minutes later, the door pops open, and the staff, without walking into the cell, they just through the crack of the door and the wall, they just toss it into the room, and it lands on the floor. And I looked at it, and I wasn't very excited to jump out of the bunk and pick up the book.
Yeah.
But, later on that afternoon, well, actually at nighttime, and when you're in juvenile hall and they say lights are out, you'll hear lights out, and then the sound like, psh. But the lights never really go out. They're just kind of dimmed because they have to walk and look through the window, and they want to make sure that you're not committing suicide or harming yourself. So when the lights went out, I got up and I picked up the book and I looked at it, and I was even more disappointed now with my mother because the image on the cover was an illustration, and if it was of a young white boy with holding a brush with white paint dripping from it, and behind him was a half whitewashed wall. And I'm sure
right. Tom Sawyer.
The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And I looked at it, and I was like, "Is this a children's book? My mother thinks I'm a child." And nonetheless, I remembered the promise that I made her, and I remember how happy she became when I made that promise to her.
Yeah.
And I knew that she was going to ask me about the book, and I didn't want to break her heart more than I had already done so, just by me being not only in juvenile hall, but now in solitary confinement for fighting. So I picked it up, and there's a light that came through the window, and it's the moonlight. It was so strong that night. And so I stood up and I put it against where that light was hitting the wall. And I started reading it. And before you know it, I was into it. I was like, "Man, this kid Tom Sawyer is like, he's not that bad. He's not that different from me." Conniving, manipulative, has fantastic friend, Huck Finn. And so before I knew it, the room began to get flooded with light. And I was like, "What?" Morning was coming. And I hadn't realized it, but I've been standing up and, walking around, but always with the book in my hand.
Wow.
And so what had occurred is that I had finished that entire book in one standing.
Wow.
And so eventually I just sat down in the morning, and it was almost like a high. And I was like, "Man, that felt pretty good.
Huh.
What had happened was that I had been transported to Hannibal, Missouri, right? This
Right.
fictional place that Mark Twain had conjured up. And it's a feeling that I had never experienced before.
Yeah.
And so this is where my life really turns to books, because my mother, like I said earlier, she's always been a voracious reader. And for a long time in our lives, we shared the same bed, because all we could afford, my mother that is, was 1-bedroom apartments or rooms in a family member's house or something close to that.
Right.
And so, maybe up to the age where I was 8 or 9, she would read in bed and she would read out loud to me. She would have her little flashlight and her book. And she would read books, initially like The Giving Tree, The Little Prince, and Where the Sidewalk Ends. And then later, she would read from Don Quixote La Mancha to me. She would read from Les Miserables to me. She would read all these great big books. And as a child, you don't understand what that means, but you're enjoying that those words are flowing from your mother's mouth.
Sure.
And they're, making their way into your ears. And I would go to bed with that. But eventually, as I grew, I just kind of pushed that away, because it wasn't manly per se, right?
Yep.
So now here I am, 16 years old in solitary confinement, and I read this book and it does something to me. And so that same day I come out to shower, and when you're in solitary confinement, you're escorted by yourself to the shower. And the shower is only 5 minutes. And I come out and I'm being escorted back to my cell with the guard behind me. And I look to the left of me and I see something that I hadn't seen before in the rec room. And it's a bookshelf. And upon this bookshelf are a bunch of books, and they're not well organized. But I stop and I'm with my hands in my back, and I have this towel wrapped around me, and I'm still dripping wet. And I stop abruptly, and the guard bumps me with his belly, and he says, "Why are you stopping?" And I point to the bookshelf, and I said, "Those books, can I get one?" And he was shocked. He's like, "What do you want a book for?" And I had to explain to him so I could read it. So he gives me 2 minutes. I go up to the bookshelf, and I'm looking for a book like Huck Finn, but I don't see any. It's nothing but thick books with glossy covers. I know now that they were, part of the Harlequin romance novels series. So I take one back, and it's, if you've ever read them, they can get pretty graphic. So for a young boy in solitary confinement, they were pretty good books to have.
Okay.
But nonetheless, I tell my mom about this over the phone, and she tells me, "No, put that book down. That's not a good book. I'm going to bring you another book on Sunday." And so she does, and she brings me The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
And so, and that's the last book that I read while in solitary confinement. And when I'm released eventually from juvenile hall, and I serve out, not the 9 months, I serve out 7, and they let me out on house arrest. And when they let me out on house arrest, my mother's already living in San Diego. She'd purchased the house to keep me away from the gangs in Orange County. But because she's living in San Diego and I served the time in Orange County, I can't leave the county. So I move into my cousin's house in the city of Santana, and I serve out my time on house arrest there. And while I'm serving out my time on house arrest, my mom comes one day and she says, "Son, grab your stuff because I'm going to enroll you in college." And that blows my mind. I'm like, "Mom, college?" First of all, I never finished high school.
Yeah.
Second of all, I'm not 18. I'm 17.
Had you had your GED?
But I'd gotten my GED while I
Okay.
was incarcerated in
I
camp.
see. Yeah.
And that was my mom's explanation. She said,
Yeah.
"Son, you don't have to be 18. She went and had done the research already. You have your GED, so you could be enrolled as a 17-year-old. And this was the thing that convinced me. She said, "And by the way, if you're in college, it'll give your probation officer a reason to let you out of the house." And I was like, that is so true.
Mm-hmm.
So I go, she enrolls me in a psychology class. She purchased the very expensive textbook.
Sure.
And initially I really try, but I know something about myself that I didn't know then. I'm dyslexic. And as much as I tried to do the homework and read the book, and when you're reading about particular subjects, they come with particular jargon.
Sure.
And I would get frustrated, and eventually I just closed the book and I would just show up to class. I just couldn't. And, I didn't know how to ask for help either. I'd never known how to be a student.
You weren't a student. That's right. Yeah.
And the worst part of it was that I got involved in a fight while on campus with another friend of mine with a rival gang member. And it was the, top of the day, noon, when the school is thriving at its highest. And I end up stabbing this student with a mechanical pencil, and I puncture him up and down his abdomen. Suffice it to say, they kicked me out for 10 years. The president tells me, you could take the 10-year suspension or we can call the police. And because I was on house arrest, I didn't want to antagonize my probation officer and give him a reason to send me back to juvenile hall.
Sure. Yeah.
So I take the 10-year suspension. I go home. I tell my mother. It breaks her heart again. And I serve out the remainder of my house arrest without any issues. But only months after that, on October 25th of 1996, I convinced my mother to lend me her van so that I could drive from San Diego down to Orange County. And I tell her that I'm coming to see a girl, which is not true, because the first thing I do when I arrive in Orange County is go to my neighborhood and pick up some of my homeboys, my gang affiliates. Yeah. And we go out that night and we go to a gas station near where we hang out at. And it was common for us to go into this gas station and take whatever we wanted and walk out without paying or run out. And the clerk never did anything because we intimidated him that much. But I take it that on this particular evening, he'd been fed up because it was the same clerk that we'd had seen only a couple weeks earlier, and we'd done the same thing. So one of my friends and I walk in with our hoodies on. We walk straight to the refrigerator where the alcohol is. We take 2 cases of beer each, and we walk straight to the counter. We look down at the clerk. He looks away, and we run out. I didn't even know this clerk could speak English because he never said a word, and I could tell that he was a Mexican national. Immigrant, just like my mother had been many years previous.
Yep.
But as I'm running out in clear English, I hear him say, "Stop or I'll shoot." But before I could process what he'd said, he had already pulled the trigger and I was already on the floor. Beer cans everywhere. I flip myself over instinctively and I try to get up, but there's nothing I can do except reach for the beer cans next to me and chuck them at him, because he's standing by the door and I could see a silhouette and the gun at his side with the smoke rising from the muzzle. And I'm telling him that I'm going to come back and kill him. My friends roll up in the van and they want to take me to the hospital, but I tell them no, because I'm smart enough to recognize that they might cause more damage if they move me. So I tell them to take the van to my mom's and to leave me there for the paramedics. And only one of my friends stays with me. The police come with their guns drawn at me. They search my body. The bullet is protruding from right below my right pec. It's only being held in there by my skin. It had lost its strength and it felt like a pimple.
So that was a bullet that hit you from behind. It hit and went all the way through your body.
It had zigzagged, hit my my appendix, hit my liver, and I would learn later by the doctor that I had missed one of my main arteries to my heart by like 1 millimeter.
Wow.
So I'm taken to Long Beach Memorial. The last thing I remember is the doctor telling me to count to 10 backwards, and she places the mask on me, and by 10, 9, 8, I'm gone.
Yeah.
I wake up days later from an induced coma, and I'm told that I'm paralyzed from the waist down, and it's complete, nothing I can do. And my mom's there, of course, weeping, completely drenched in her own tears. And I'm silent. I'm stoic. I don't know what to say. I kind of accept it, quicker than my mother does because I had already known that becoming a paraplegic was an outcome, a potential outcome for being a gang member. Because often
you had seen it before.
I'd seen it before,
Yeah.
many times in people that I'd known. So, you go to prison for life or you die. But the other option is that you could become paralyzed, right? Or even worse. So that's it. I came out of the hospital and my mother tried to enroll me again at various colleges. I went to Palomar College, took a reading class, didn't do well. Enrolled me in Santa Ana College, took a history class, dropped out. Not even a year after being shot, I found myself at a house party in the city of Anaheim. And I had a gun on me. And I was with a few of my gang friends, and we were approached by a rival gang. And I shot a rival gang member from my wheelchair. And I was 18 years old now. So when I was arrested, I was taken to the county jail as an adult.
Yeah.
And this is where my life really starts to change because this is like where I'm hitting rock bottom. I'm in my wheelchair in the county jail and I'm being processed and I'm in line to learn what my bail's going to be. And when I come to the kiosk, this great big thing at the center of the processing center, and sitting behind this wall is this big burly deputy. And he's looking at a TV, at a monitor, and then he's looking at me. And then he finally says to me, "Are you in a wheelchair?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he says, "Are you in a wheelchair because you were shot?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "How do you think your mother feels that her son, who's in a wheelchair because he was shot, is now in a wheelchair because he shot another boy?" And he used the word boy. And that right there in that moment, it's like he was placing a mirror up to my face. And in that mirror, he was showing me not the pain that I was causing myself, but the pain that I was causing my mother. And so I wanted to drop to my knees and just weep. But next to me were hardened gang members and convicts who were, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s even, who had been in prison for many years. So I couldn't show weakness. But when they sent me back to the holding tank, and because of my condition, being in a wheelchair, they wouldn't place me with other people for my own safety. Placed me in the holding tank, and it's glass, but I turned to the brick wall where nobody could see me, and I start crying. Just thinking about my mother, not even myself. And so my mother bails me out, and she puts up her house for collateral, this house that she had worked so hard for, this house that was the beginning of her American dream. And now here I was destroying that. So I'm on bail, and I'm on bail for about 2 years fighting this case. My mom gets me 2 good lawyers. And again, her solution is go back to college. And now she enrolls me at Cypress Community College. And there's where I really start to take off because I know that I have to make a decision and fast.
Yeah.
So when she enrolls me at Cypress Community College, now it's an English class.
Mm-hmm.
And the first assignment for this class, it's an in-class assignment, and the professor says, write about a life-changing experience. And so I do. I think, well, I have a lot of those. And so I do.
Yeah.
I submit it. The next time we're in class, she dismisses class and she calls me back. And because I've always had a negative relationship with teachers, I thought that she was going to tell me that I wasn't a good writer and that I shouldn't be in her class. But it was everything to the contrary. She said that my writing was some of the best writing she'd seen in years. And I was surprised and shocked. But at the same time, I felt good because she was recognizing something good that I was able to do. Sure. And that set me on a trajectory of education because I wanted to hear more of that from her and from other professors. So I started taking English courses and I would pass them. I wasn't an A student, but B, C, B here. Finally, she gave me an A in one of her literature, her honors classes. And that just even compounded my glee even more, just being recognized for doing something good.
So this one woman, obviously your mother was there too, but this one individual who took a minute and really, encourage you. That's
Yeah,
very moving, very
her name is
touching.
Professor Christy Deep at Cypress College.
Is she still around?
She's still around.
Wherever you are, Christy Deep, if you're hearing this podcast, you're making me tear up here. It's very powerful.
Yeah.
So your life, you got some affirmation. You got some people in your life who believed in you.
Correct.
Other than doing bad things, you were now
Right.
doing some good things.
Yes, sir.
And you were learning how to read. You were learning how to write. You were learning how to convey ideas. And where did that take you?
Well, at the same time as I'm going to school, I'm still going to court fighting this case. And the whole thing, because I don't go to trial, takes about 2 years where my lawyers finally come to an agreement with the district attorney. And the agreement is that I plead guilty to 3 charges and I do 12 years in prison.
Wow.
And so the 3 charges are reckless discharge of a firearm, causing great bodily injury, and being a gang member. And I remember the day when my lawyers brought it to me. They said, Karen has offered you a deal. And I knew her so well that we were on a first name basis, the DA, because she had also prosecuted me as a young man, as a youth. And my lawyer said to me, this is the best deal you're going to get because of your history and you're a certified gang member, classified gang member. And I looked at my mom, and my mom just nodded her head and, tears running down her face, telling me, sign it, because she agreed with my lawyers.
And that was a 12-year
prison sentence. So I grabbed the pen, I signed it. They took it back to the DA. She took it back to the judge, and the judge got up on the stand and he said, young man, I understand you reached an agreement with the district attorney. I said, yes, sir. He said, you understand you're going to be serving 12 years in prison? I said, yes, sir. He said, okay, come back 30 days from now, at which point you'll be taken into custody. So I go home, I continue to go to school. Those 30 days are up. I come back to be taken into custody. The courthouse is filled with my family members, my teachers, of course, my mother's there, and my girlfriend, who'd later become my wife and later my ex-wife, unfortunately, is there too. And the judge comes out and he calls the lawyers into chambers, counsel into chambers, and they're gone for like 30 minutes. And I'm getting anxious because I just want to get this clock started on the 12 years. I'm looking at my mother. She's confused. I'm even looking at the bailiff. The bailiff's like, don't look at me.
Yeah.
Finally, the judge and the lawyers come out, and my lawyers tell me, Obed, you're not going to jail today. But I don't understand it. So the judge gets up there, and the first words out of his mouth are, I'm not sending this young man to prison. And I understood in that moment when he said that I wasn't going to prison at all. Because initially when my lawyers told me, I thought it was just going to be pushed back for another date, because that happens often. But the judge, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I have to give the district attorney credit because she struck one of my strikes, because I was a 2-striker at that time at 18. And because she struck one of those strikes, it gave the judge discrepancy.
I see.
And that allowed him to, instead of sending me to prison, give me another sentence.
Right. So you weren't a 3-striker, because when you're 3 strikes, you're out.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that's what they were trying to achieve, but because that strike was stricken, the judge was allowed discrepancy. Whereas if it was not, I had to do the 12 years.
I see.
Because I had signed the deal. But the judge got up there and he said, I'm not sending this young man to prison because I don't think it's going to help him, do him any good. And so he started explaining it. And part of it was, of course, the county did a probation report on me. And that probation report said that I was a threat to society, I was a gang member, and I was, probably going to commit crimes again and hurt other people. My lawyers, being the good lawyers that they are, they hired a private probation officer to do a private report. And in that report, they showed that I was a student who was about to graduate. They showed that I was an artist, that I was talented in drawing and painting, and they included some of those images there. And in addition to that, they had many letters of support from my family members, teachers, and other people in the community.
Wow.
And so the judge said, the 12 years are not dismissed. They're just looming over your head. Instead, I'm sentencing you to 5 years on gang terms probation, which is the strictest probation you can get. And he said, if you violate any of those terms of probation, you'll be taken into custody to serve out the 12 years without any questions asked. And he looked at me in a very stern and serious manner and he said, do you understand? I said, I do. And he wished me luck. And he said, I wish you the best, young man. And I left court that day, and it gives me the chills today, and I want to cry because, if not for what he had done, I don't know if I'd be here today. If I'd gone to prison, I probably would have died given my condition and just the lack of medical care that is there for someone like me.
Yeah.
But I left that day, and my mom on the top of those court steps said, son, you know what you're going to do Monday? Because it's a Friday. It was always a Friday. I said, yeah, Mom, I'm going to school. But can we go get a hamburger first? Because I'm hungry. She said, anything you want. And that was it. I went back to school. I graduated within the next couple of months. And that summer, got my AA. My teacher was there. My family was there. And I enrolled at Cal State Los Angeles shortly after. And I got my bachelor's degree in creative writing in 2005, 2006.
Okay.
And then I got my master's in English literature with the emphasis in medieval literature in 2008. And I've been a professor of English ever since
that time.
Yeah. Doing adjunct work at Orange Coast and Cypress, and then finally becoming a tenured professor at East Los Angeles College.
Amazing story. Well, your story is kind of brings tears to my eyes too. I have to tell you, just that judge and that DA who helped you really changed the direction of your life in such a good way. But I have to say, Obed, you have a loving mother. You have a mother. Is your mother still with us?
She is.
Was she living down in San Diego? Or is she?
No, she's here in Orange County.
Okay.
I do got to say, she just retired from her longtime job.
Yeah.
As a financial advisor and supervisor, and she's looking to move back to Chihuahua, Mexico, build her hacienda out there, and just spend her years there. But right now she's in Colorado visiting family.
Yeah.
And she's a very happy woman.
And she's proud of you.
Absolutely proud of me. My sister, who's in her 30s, and my brother, who's in his 20s, and my sister graduated from college and from high school, is a mother, and my brother graduated from Santa Barbara University, and he has a BA in physics.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Obed, I there's so many things we could talk about here. I mean, just kind of as we finish off our conversation, but the subtitle of my podcast is "Where Kids and Culture Collide," and you're talking to parents here, not maybe some kids, but I'm curious. Can you give us some pieces of advice? You're talking to people who have young children, and people who have an interest in maybe their grandparents or whatever. What kind of advice you've lived a very, very different life than many people. You've had some hard knocks. Right. And you're in a wheelchair, friends. Right. As I have this conversation, Obed is in a wheelchair. He's a paraplegic, but you've lived some things, and I'm curious what kind of recommendations you would make to people.
Well, to parents, I would say unconditional love, because that's what I received from my mother. Unconditional, no matter in what predicament I put myself, she was always there to lead the charge in fighting for me, fighting for my life, fighting for my freedom. And I'll couple that with some words from Ralph Ellison in The Invisible Man, where he writes that when you push a man away, you never set him on the right path. And I think had my mom ever pushed me away, I would never have been on this path here. So definitely that unconditional love, that support, because, from my own experience, no matter how dire the situation was, if not for my mother, I would not have made it. Yeah. And my mother she's my hero. Yeah.
Love to meet your mother.
In many ways.
Yeah.
So that's the advice that I would give, and not to give up, because a lot of times we give up on children easily.
Yeah.
And our answers are always to medicate them or, or I don't know. It's just, that doesn't seem like the correct answer to me. Whereas, being there for them physically, when you're most needed as a parent, I believe is the strongest, most powerful thing a parent can do for a child. Um, so yeah, and I get this question asked often, and there are no magic tricks.
Yeah.
There are no magic tricks. It's hard work, and I saw it in my mom, and I thank her for everything that she's done.
Yeah.
And books, reading.
Reading.
That was all.
So I want to end this conversation. A couple of things. Number one, I want to bring to everyone's attention. Obed Silva has written a book. It's called a memoir by Obed Silva. The title of the book is the Death of My Father, the Pope. And it is available on Amazon. Is that correct?
And any bookstore.
In bookstores. So again, The Death of My Father, the Pope, by a memoir by Obed Silva. I encourage you to pick it up. It had a great review in the LA Times not too long ago, and this I'm looking forward to my copy arriving so I can read it as well. So Obed, last question, okay? Sure. And this is fascinating to me. You are an associate professor of English with an emphasis on medieval history. I find that to be such a non sequitur based on your life and your experience in life. What is it about medieval history that got you going?
It's not history, literature.
Okay, medieval literature. Okay,
English,
all right.
Medieval literature, sure.
But tell us about that, because I find that to be fascinating.
Well, first I got to say that my favorite writers are Victor Hugo and Fyodor Dostoevsky. My favorite book of all time that really also played a role in changing my life is Les Miserables, because my mother will always tell me, "You're in that book. You're in that book."
Yeah.
But having read those books and then going to university and doing my grad work, one of the first survey classes that I took there was on medieval literature. And the professor, Dr. Calabresi, who I admire very much till this day, and he's a good friend of mine, he's a religious man, very Catholic. And I remember the first day of class, he said to the entire class, the reason most students do not major in medieval literature or have an emphasis on medieval literature is because it's the most difficult. And so I sat there quietly, but in my head, I was like, how difficult could it be? I mean, I've been through hell and back.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying this to myself in my brain, and I'm going to take that as a challenge, and I'm going to make that my emphasis.
Wow.
And so I ended up taking 7 medieval courses with him, as well as with other professors. I took other courses, but with him, it was the most I've ever taken with one professor. Number one, because I respected him as a professor, and I loved his teaching methods. And so, yeah, that was it. But another component to that is that once I started learning about medieval literature, I could relate to it because it's filled with a lot of Catholic tropes. There's a lot of Catholicism within it.
Sure.
And so having had a Catholic upbringing as a child, learning about the saints through my grandmother, she teaching me how to pray the rosary, like all these things came back to me.
Yeah.
And so when I'm reading these texts, I'm also in a way reliving my childhood with my great grandmother who's passed. So that was one those were the driving forces.
Yeah. Is that what you teach now in East LA?
No, unfortunately not. Although sometimes I do get to weave in some medieval literature like Chaucer or Langland into there, or maybe even Dante. But for the most part, I teach writing, American literature, poetry, creative writing.
Wow. Interesting. Fascinating. Well, Obed Silva, you have kind of taken me to a different place today, I have to say. and I'm sure that the listeners would agree to that. So this has been a really interesting conversation. So friends, you have been listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. It's been an incredible pleasure to speak with Obed Silva, a remarkable man, a man who has really lived through some things and came out on the right side, I think, of the equation. So my hat's off to you, Obed. How do people find you, by the way, out there?
How do people find me?
If they want to find you, how do they find you?
Well, I guess social media. I'm on Instagram, Captain1862. A lot of my artwork is there. A lot of my keynote engagements are there. Yeah, that's
And through East LA College.
And through East LA College,
Okay.
you could email me there. I'm at Silva JO. That's SILVAJO at elac.edu.
Okay, there we go. And friends, so thank you for tuning in today to the Hamilton Review. We've been listening to Obed Silva, amazing professor of English at East LA College. Obed, again, thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you, sir.
Until next time, friends, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.